In March 1989, Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-medical student from the University of Texas, crossed the border into Matamoros, Mexico, for what should have been a typical spring break celebration. He was with 3 friends, enjoying the bars and nightlife that attracted thousands of American college students each year. But as the group walked back toward the border in the early morning hours of March 14, Mark vanished. His friends turned around, and he was simply gone, disappeared into the humid Mexican night. What his friends, family, and authorities didn't know was that Mark had become the latest victim of a cult that blended drug trafficking with human sacrifice, led by a charismatic Cuban-American named Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo. The search for Mark Kilroy would ultimately expose one of the most horrifying criminal organizations in North American history, a cult that believed human sacrifice would grant them supernatural protection in their drug smuggling operations. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born on November 1, 1962, in Miami, Florida, to a Cuban immigrant mother, Delia Aurora González del Valle. His biological father was absent, and his early childhood was marked by instability and exposure to the darker corners of spirituality. His mother, a priestess in the Afro-Caribbean religion of Palo Mayombe, introduced young Adolfo to a world where the spiritual and material realms intertwined, where blood sacrifice was power, and where the dead could be commanded to serve the living. Palo Mayombe, brought to Cuba by enslaved Africans, is a legitimate religion for many practitioners, focusing on veneration of spirits and ancestors. But in the hands of Delia and later her son, it would be twisted into something far more sinister. She took Adolfo to Haiti as a child, where he was allegedly apprenticed to Bakers, practitioners of the darker aspects of Vodou. He learned about zombification, spirit possession, and the power that came from controlling both the living and the dead. The family moved frequently during Adolfo's youth, from Miami to Puerto Rico, from Puerto Rico to Mexico City. This rootlessness, combined with his mother's teachings and his own growing narcissism, created a young man who believed he possessed supernatural powers and was destined for greatness. He was intelligent and charismatic, fluent in English and Spanish, and possessed an almost hypnotic ability to convince others of his divine authority. As a teenager in Mexico City, Constanzo began developing his own synthesis of religious practices. He combined elements of Palo Mayombe with Santeria, added aspects of Aztec mythology, and incorporated his own increasingly violent interpretations. He studied the writings of occultists and the practices of ancient Mesoamerican cultures that had practiced human sacrifice. But unlike academic scholars or genuine religious practitioners, Constanzo saw in these traditions not spiritual enlightenment but a pathway to power. By his early 20s, Constanzo had established himself as a palero, a priest of Palo Mayombe, in Mexico City. But he marketed himself as much more, a psychic, a fortune teller, a cleanser of curses, and most importantly, a provider of supernatural protection. His clientele began with the desperate and superstitious poor but soon expanded to include a surprising demographic, Mexican celebrities, politicians, and law enforcement officials. His reputation grew through a combination of genuine charisma, clever cold reading techniques, and an uncanny ability to tell people what they wanted to hear. He performed limpias, spiritual cleansings, for famous Mexican actresses and singers. He provided protection rituals for police commanders. He cast spells for politicians seeking electoral victory. His clients included Irma Serrano, a famous Mexican actress and singer, and Florentino Ventura, a high-ranking officer in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. What his wealthy clients didn't know was that Constanzo's rituals were becoming increasingly dark. While he performed relatively benign ceremonies for his celebrity clientele, he was simultaneously developing a theology that demanded blood sacrifice for real power. He began with animals, chickens, goats, and eventually larger animals. But Constanzo believed, or at least taught his followers, that the ultimate power came from human blood. He gathered around himself a group of devoted followers who saw him as a godlike figure. He called himself El Padrino, the Godfather, and demanded absolute loyalty. His followers included both men and women, rich and poor, educated and illiterate. What they shared was a complete devotion to Constanzo and a belief in his supernatural powers. Among his inner circle was Sarah Aldrete, known as La Madrina, the godmother, an honor student at Texas Southmost College who became his high priestess and lover. There was also Elio Hernandez Rivera, a law enforcement officer who became one of his most devoted followers. These weren't marginalized individuals looking for meaning, many were successful, educated people who fell under Constanzo's spell. In 1988, Constanzo made a connection that would transform his cult from a group of occult practitioners into a deadly criminal organization. He met the Hernandez family, who controlled drug trafficking operations in Matamoros, just across the border from Brownsville, Texas. The family was led by brothers Serafin Hernandez Garcia and Ovidio Hernandez Garcia, who were struggling to maintain their marijuana smuggling routes into the United States. Constanzo convinced the Hernandez brothers that he could provide them with supernatural protection that would make them invisible to law enforcement and invulnerable to bullets. He demonstrated his powers through elaborate rituals and claimed that his magic had been responsible for their past successes. The desperate and superstitious drug dealers, facing pressure from both law enforcement and rival cartels, embraced Constanzo's promises of mystical protection. The merger of Constanzo's cult with the Hernandez drug operation created a unique criminal organization. They established their headquarters at Rancho Santa Elena, a remote property outside Matamoros that served as both a drug warehouse and a temple for increasingly violent rituals. Constanzo insisted that for the protection spells to work, they needed to make regular sacrifices to the Nana, a ritual cauldron that, in his twisted version of Palo Mayum, required human remains and blood. Constanzo developed an elaborate mythology around the cult's activities. He taught that the spirits of the dead, particularly those who died violently, could be enslaved and forced to protect the living. The Nana at Rancho Santa Elena became the centerpiece of the cult's rituals. It was filled with human and animal remains, blood, scorpions, spiders, and various ritual objects. Constanzo claimed that this Nana contained a powerful spirit that would protect the drug smugglers as long as it was properly fed with blood. The cult members were required to participate in increasingly violent rituals. They would drink blood, eat human flesh, and watch as Constanzo performed ceremonies that he claimed would make them invulnerable. He demonstrated his powers by having followers shoot at him with guns loaded with blanks, though the followers believed the bullets were real and that his magic was protecting him. This theatrical deception reinforced their belief in his supernatural abilities. The exact number of people murdered by Constanzo's cult may never be known. The first confirmed ritual murders began in 1988, though there's evidence suggesting earlier killings. The victims were often chosen randomly, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. They targeted drug dealers from rival gangs, farmers from remote areas, and sometimes members of their own organization who had shown disloyalty or knew too much. The killing ritual was horrifyingly consistent. Victims would be brought to Rancho Santa Elena, where they would be tortured to increase their fear and pain. Constanzo taught that terror made the sacrifice more powerful. They would be mutilated while still alive, with Constanzo removing parts of their bodies for use in his rituals. The spine, brain, and heart were considered particularly powerful. The victims would finally be killed, often through decapitation or having their hearts cut out, and their blood would be drained into the Nana. After death, the bodies would be further dismembered. Body parts would be cooked and sometimes consumed by cult members in cannibalistic rituals that Constanzo claimed would transfer the victim's power to the participants. The remains would either be buried at the ranch or disposed of in remote locations. The cult believed that each murder made them stronger and more protected. By March 1989, Constanzo's cult had been operating with impunity for months. They had successfully smuggled tons of marijuana across the border, and their ritual murders had gone undetected. The cult members believed they were truly invisible to law enforcement, protected by their dark magic. It was in this context of absolute confidence that they made the fatal mistake that would lead to their downfall. On the night of March 13 to 14, 1989, several cult members were in Matamoros, mingling with the crowds of American spring breakers. They had been ordered by Constanzo to find a young American to sacrifice. He believed that an American victim, particularly a young, educated one, would provide especially powerful protection for a major drug shipment they were planning. Mark Kilroy, walking with his friends back to the border, was selected purely by chance. Serafin Hernandez Jr., nephew of the drug-dealing brothers, pulled up alongside Mark and somehow lured him into his truck. The exact method, whether by force, deception, or the promise of a party, remains unclear. Within moments, Mark was driven away, leaving his friends confused and increasingly worried as the hours passed without his return. Mark Kilroy was taken to Rancho Santa Elena, where he was held for several hours. The details of what happened to him, based on later confessions from cult members, are almost too horrific to recount. He was tortured and mutilated while still alive, his suffering prolonged because Constanzo believed that fear and pain enhanced the power of the sacrifice. Finally, his brain was removed while he was still breathing, and his body was dismembered. His brain and other organs were added to the nana, and his spine was used to make a necklace that Constanzo wore. The cult members believed that Mark's sacrifice would provide particularly powerful protection because he was an American college student, educated, young, and from a privileged background. Constanzo told his followers that Mark's spirit would be enslaved to protect their drug operations and that his death would make them invincible to American law enforcement. Mark's disappearance immediately triggered an intensive search. His uncle, Ken Kilroy, was a U.S. Customs official who used his connections to pressure Mexican authorities. The case received massive media attention, with Mark's parents appearing on television to plead for information. The U.S. State Department became involved, and a $15,000 reward was offered for information leading to Mark's whereabouts. The pressure on Mexican authorities was immense. American spring breakers were crucial to the Matamoros economy, and Mark's disappearance threatened to devastate tourism. Mexican federal police, state police, and local law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history. They questioned hundreds of people, searched numerous properties, and followed dozens of leads that went nowhere. For weeks, the search continued without success. The Kilroy family maintained a vigil, hoping against hope that Mark might still be alive. They distributed thousands of flyers, gave countless interviews, and worked tirelessly to keep the case in the public eye. What they didn't know was that their son had been dead since the night he disappeared, his remains buried in a shallow grave at a ranch just miles from where he was taken. On April 1, 1989, 2 weeks after Mark's disappearance, a seemingly unrelated incident began the chain of events that would expose the cult. Serafin Hernandez Jr., the nephew who had abducted Mark, approached a police checkpoint near Matamoros. The officers, who had been briefed about the missing American student, prepared to search vehicles. But Serafin, believing in Constanzo's promise of invisibility, drove straight through the checkpoint without stopping. The shocked officers gave chase and eventually stopped him. When asked why he had run the checkpoint, Serafin seemed genuinely confused. He reportedly said that the officers shouldn't have been able to see him, that he was supposed to be invisible. This bizarre statement, combined with his nervous behavior and the discovery of marijuana in his truck, led to his arrest. Under interrogation, Serafin began to reveal the existence of the cult. At first, investigators thought they were dealing with a delusional drug dealer. But as Serafin provided more details about ritual sacrifices and supernatural protection, and particularly when he mentioned an American student, the authorities realized they might have found a lead in the Kilroy case. On April 11, 1989, Serafin Hernandez led authorities to Rancho Santa Elena. What they found there exceeded their worst nightmares. The stench of death permeated the property. In a small shack, they found the na-na, the iron cauldron filled with blood, human and animal remains, skulls, and ritual objects. The sight was so disturbing that several officers became physically ill. As they searched the property, they discovered a series of shallow graves. The first body they exhumed was Mark Kilroy's, identifiable by his distinctive jewelry. But he was far from the only victim. They eventually discovered 15 mutilated corpses, though the actual number of victims was likely higher. The bodies showed evidence of extreme torture, mutilation, and in some cases, cannibalism. The discovery made international headlines. The combination of drug trafficking, human sacrifice, and the murder of an American student created a media sensation. News crews from around the world descended on Matamoros. The graphic nature of the crimes and the occult elements captivated and horrified the public. Parents canceled their children's spring break plans, and tourism to Mexican border towns plummeted. 4 cult members were arrested at the ranch, including Serafin Hernandez and Elio Hernandez Rivera. Under interrogation, they provided detailed confessions about the cult's activities, Constanzo's role as leader, and the murders they had committed. They spoke matter-of-factly about human sacrifice, cannibalism, and their belief in supernatural protection, shocking even experienced investigators. The confessions revealed the full scope of the cult's operations. They described how Constanzo had ordered specific sacrifices before major drug shipments, how victims were selected, and the ritual significance of different types of mutilation. They identified other cult members and provided information about additional murder sites. Perhaps most disturbingly, they showed no remorse, still believing that the sacrifices had been necessary for their protection. The Mexican authorities, working with American law enforcement, launched a massive manhunt for Constanzo and his inner circle. They raided properties in Matamoros and Mexico City, gradually piecing together the cult's network. But Constanzo, Sarah Aldrete, and several key followers had vanished, warned by corrupt police contacts about the raid at Rancho Santa Elena. As news of the Rancho Santa Elena discovery spread across Mexico, Adolfo Constanzo watched from his hideout in Mexico City. He had fled Matamoros days before the ranch was raided, warned by his contacts in law enforcement. With him were his most devoted followers, Sarah Aldrete, his high priestess and lover, Martin Quintana Rodriguez, his male lover and enforcer, and several other cult members who remained fanatically loyal despite the collapse of their organization. Constanzo was furious about the arrests and the exposure of his operations. He blamed the Hernandez family for their stupidity and lack of faith. He claimed that the sacrifices had failed to protect them because they had not followed his instructions precisely. Even as his world crumbled around him, he maintained his persona as a powerful sorcerer, telling his remaining followers that he would perform a ritual that would make them all invisible to their pursuers. The group moved between safe houses in Mexico City, aided by Constanzo's extensive network of clients and corrupted officials. Some of his wealthy clients, terrified that their association with him would be exposed, provided money and temporary shelter. But as the manhunt intensified and rewards for information grew larger, this network began to collapse. Former allies distanced themselves, and safe houses became increasingly difficult to find. The hunt for Constanzo became one of the largest manhunts in Mexican history. His photograph was on every newspaper front page and television news broadcast. The media had dubbed him El Padrino de los Narcosatanicos, the godfather of the narco-Satanists, and the public was both terrified and fascinated by the story of the charismatic cult leader who had orchestrated human sacrifices. Sarah Aldrete became equally notorious as La Madrina. The media was particularly captivated by her story. How had an honor student, a young woman from a respectable family who was studying to be a teacher, become the high priestess of a murderous cult? Her photograph, showing an attractive young woman with an innocent appearance, seemed incompatible with the horrific crimes she was accused of participating in. The Mexican government, embarrassed by the international attention and pressure from the United States, devoted enormous resources to the manhunt. They offered substantial rewards for information, conducted raids across multiple states, and questioned hundreds of people connected to Constanzo's network. The President of Mexico personally promised that the fugitives would be captured and brought to justice. By late April 1989, Constanzo and his remaining followers were trapped in a Mexico City apartment on Rio Sena Street. They had run out of safe houses, their money was dwindling, and the police were closing in. Constanzo grew increasingly paranoid and violent, convinced that his followers were losing faith in his powers. He conducted frantic rituals, trying to summon supernatural aid, but even his most devoted followers began to sense that the end was near. On May 6, 1989, police received a tip about suspicious activity at the Rio Sena apartment. As they surrounded the building, someone inside, likely Constanzo himself, opened fire with an automatic weapon. A fierce gun battle erupted, with hundreds of rounds fired from the apartment. The shooting lasted for approximately 45 minutes, with police unable to enter the apartment due to the intensity of the gunfire. Inside the apartment, Constanzo realized there was no escape. According to the survivors' accounts, he ordered his followers to kill him rather than allow him to be captured. He apparently believed that his death in a ritual context would transform him into a powerful spirit that could continue to protect his followers. When his followers hesitated, he became enraged, threatening them with spiritual retribution if they didn't obey. As police prepared to storm the apartment, Constanzo gave his final order. He commanded Alvaro de Leon Valdez, one of his followers, to kill him and Martín Quintana. Still terrified of their leader even in these final moments, Valdez obeyed. He shot both Constanzo and Quintana with a machine gun, killing them instantly. Constanzo was 26 years old. When police finally entered the apartment, they found Constanzo and Quintana's bodies along with a hysterical Sarah Aldrete and several other cult members. Aldrete immediately began claiming that she had been held against her will, that she was a victim rather than a participant. She would maintain this story throughout her trial, despite overwhelming evidence of her willing participation in the cult's activities. The apartment contained evidence of the cult's final days, ritual objects, blood-stained altars, and the weapons used in the shootout. They also found Constanzo's personal effects, including journals that detailed some of his rituals and his philosophy of power through sacrifice. These documents would provide investigators with crucial insights into the cult's beliefs and practices. The trials of the surviving cult members became major media events in Mexico. Sarah Aldrete's trial was particularly sensational. She presented herself as an innocent girl who had been brainwashed and coerced by Constanzo. She claimed to have been drugged, hypnotized, and threatened with death if she didn't participate. Her defense attorneys portrayed her as a victim of Constanzo's malevolent influence. However, prosecutors presented compelling evidence of her willing participation. Witnesses testified that she had been present at multiple murders, had participated in rituals involving human remains, and had held a leadership position in the cult. Other cult members testified that she had been Constanzo's willing partner, not his victim. The prosecution argued that her education and intelligence made her fully responsible for her choices. In 1990, Sarah Aldrete was convicted and sentenced to 62 years in prison for her role in the murders, though she was not directly charged with killing anyone herself. Other cult members received sentences ranging from 35 to 67 years. The trials revealed additional details about the cult's operations, including murders that had not been previously discovered and the extensive network of corruption that had protected them. For the families of the victims, the trials brought little comfort. The Kilroy family, who had become the public face of the victims' families, struggled to comprehend how their son had died. Helen Kilroy, Mark's mother, spoke publicly about their grief and their struggle to find meaning in their son's senseless death. They established a foundation in Mark's name to promote drug awareness and support other families of crime victims. Other victims' families, particularly those of Mexican nationals who had been killed by the cult, received less attention but suffered equally. Many were poor farmers or small-time criminals whose disappearances had barely been investigated before the cult's exposure. The revelation that their loved ones had been sacrificed in bizarre rituals added a layer of horror to their grief. The case raised uncomfortable questions about why Mark Kilroy's disappearance had triggered such an intensive investigation while the disappearances of Mexican citizens had been largely ignored. It highlighted the disparities in how victims were valued based on their nationality and social status, a painful reality that continues to plague missing persons cases along the border. The Constanzo case had a devastating impact on legitimate practitioners of Afro-Caribbean religions. Santeria, Palo Mayombe, and other traditions faced increased scrutiny and discrimination. Many practitioners found themselves having to defend their peaceful religious practices against associations with Constanzo's perverted version of their faith. Religious scholars and community leaders emphasized that what Constanzo practiced bore little resemblance to authentic Palo Mayombe or Santeria. These religions, while including animal sacrifice in some rituals, explicitly prohibit human sacrifice and violence. Constanzo had created his own syncretic belief system that borrowed elements from multiple traditions but ultimately reflected his own psychopathology rather than any genuine religious practice. The case also influenced popular culture's portrayal of occult crimes. It reinforced stereotypes about satanic, drug cartels and ritual murders that persist to this day. The term narcosatanicos entered the lexicon, used to describe any combination of drug trafficking and occult practices, regardless of whether any actual religious element exists. The Constanzo case exposed serious problems in Mexican law enforcement, particularly the extent of corruption that had allowed the cult to operate with impunity. Several police officers were arrested for their connections to the cult, and reforms were implemented to improve coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The case also led to increased cooperation between American and Mexican law enforcement agencies. The successful collaboration in the Kilroy investigation became a model for future cross-border investigations. Training programs were established to help law enforcement recognize signs of ritual crimes and distinguish between legitimate religious practices and criminal activities. However, the fundamental problems that allowed Constanzo's cult to flourish, corruption, poverty, and the power of drug cartels, remained largely unaddressed. The violence along the Mexican-American border would only intensify in subsequent decades, though future cartels would rely on conventional weapons rather than supernatural protection. Forensic psychologists who have studied the case have proposed various theories about Constanzo's psychology. Many believe he exhibited signs of psychopathy combined with narcissistic personality disorder. His ability to manipulate others, his lack of empathy, his grandiose sense of self-importance, and his need for admiration all fit these diagnostic criteria. Some experts have suggested that Constanzo genuinely believed in his supernatural powers, at least to some extent. His early exposure to religious practices that emphasized spiritual power, combined with his mother's reinforcement of his special status, may have created a worldview in which he saw himself as genuinely possessing magical abilities. The line between conscious deception and self-deception may have been blurred. Others argue that Constanzo was purely a con artist who used religious trappings to manipulate others for power and profit. They point to his theatrical tricks, like the staged shootings with blank bullets, as evidence that he was fully aware of his deception. In this view, the religious elements were simply tools he used to control his followers and intimidate his enemies. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Constanzo case is how educated, seemingly rational people came to participate in human sacrifice. Sarah Aldrete was an honor student. Elio Hernandez was a law enforcement officer. Many cult members were functional members of society who had families and jobs. How did they come to believe that murdering innocent people would provide supernatural protection? The answer likely lies in the gradual nature of their indoctrination. Constanzo didn't immediately demand human sacrifice from new followers. He started with smaller requests, gradually escalating the level of commitment required. By the time he introduced human sacrifice, his followers had already invested so much in their belief in his powers that they found it easier to rationalize murder than to admit they had been deceived. The group dynamics of the cult also played a crucial role. When everyone around you believes something, it becomes much easier to believe it yourself. The cult created an echo chamber where Constanzo's teachings were constantly reinforced and where doubts were seen as dangerous weakness. The fear of both supernatural retribution and very real physical violence kept members from questioning or leaving. While Constanzo's crimes were exceptional in their brutality, they occurred in a context that made them possible. The Mexican drug trade created an environment where violence was commonplace and where supernatural protection might seem like a reasonable advantage. The poverty and lack of education in some areas made people more vulnerable to manipulation by someone claiming magical powers. The corruption endemic in Mexican law enforcement allowed Constanzo to operate with impunity for far longer than should have been possible. His ability to bribe police officers and government officials gave him and his followers the impression that he really was protected by supernatural forces. When you can commit crimes without consequence, it's easier to believe you're invincible. The syncretic religious landscape of Mexico, where indigenous, African, and European spiritual traditions blend together, created a context where Constanzo's invented religion could seem plausible. In a world where many people genuinely believe in spiritual forces and magical practices, someone claiming to be a powerful sorcerer might not seem as outlandish as they would in a more secular context. Even after Constanzo's death and the conviction of his followers, investigations into the cult's activities continued for years. Law enforcement agencies believed that the 15 bodies found at Rancho Santa Elena represented only a fraction of the cult's victims. Investigators followed leads about other burial sites and missing persons who might have been sacrificed by the cult. Several additional bodies were found that were believed to be connected to the cult, though definitive proof was often lacking. The total number of victims may have been as high as 25 or more, though the exact count will likely never be known. Some victims were probably never reported missing, being undocumented immigrants or criminals whose disappearances went unnoticed. The investigation also revealed the extent of the cult's network beyond the core group. Dozens of people had some connection to the cult, whether as clients of Constanzo's spiritual services, participants in lesser rituals, or facilitators of the drug trafficking operations. Determining criminal liability for these peripheral figures proved challenging, and many escaped prosecution. Sarah Aldrete, serving her 62-year sentence, has never stopped proclaiming her innocence. She has given numerous interviews from prison, written letters to journalists, and maintained her story that she was a victim of Constanzo's mind control. She has become something of a cause célèbre for those who believe women in cults are always victims rather than perpetrators. In 2003, She was interviewed by a documentary crew and continued to insist that she had been forced to participate against her will. She claimed that Constanzo had hypnotized her, drugged her, and threatened to kill her family if she didn't comply. However, she has never been able to adequately explain evidence that contradicts her story, such as witnesses who saw her actively participating in rituals and giving orders to other cult members. Her case has raised important questions about agency and responsibility in cult settings. To what extent are cult members responsible for their actions when they're under the influence of a charismatic leader? How do we distinguish between victims and perpetrators when the lines are blurred? These questions have relevance beyond the Constanzo case, applying to many situations where group psychology and authoritarian leadership lead to violence. The Constanzo case had a lasting impact on American-Mexican border relations. It reinforced American stereotypes about Mexico as a lawless, dangerous place where bizarre crimes could occur with impunity. Tourism to border towns, already struggling with concerns about drug violence, suffered a further blow. The image of spring breakers being abducted for human sacrifice became a powerful deterrent to cross-border travel. For Mexico, the case was a national embarrassment that reinforced negative international perceptions. The government's initial failure to take missing persons reports seriously, the corruption that allowed the cult to operate, and the sensational nature of the crimes all contributed to Mexico's image problems. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with Mexican law enforcement and governance. The tragedy did lead to some positive changes in how missing persons cases are handled on both sides of the border. The attention brought to Mark Kilroy's case highlighted the need for better coordination between American and Mexican authorities when citizens crossed the border. New protocols were established for sharing information and conducting joint investigations. Ironically, one of the most significant impacts of the Constanzo case may have been on the drug cartels themselves. The massive law enforcement response triggered by the ritual murders and the international attention they attracted taught the cartels that certain types of violence were counterproductive. While cartel violence would actually increase in subsequent decades, ritual or occult-themed murders became less common. Modern cartels learned that conventional violence, shootings, beheadings, torture, while horrific, didn't capture the public imagination in the same way as ritual sacrifice. They could kill far more people with less law enforcement attention as long as they avoided the occult elements that had made Constanzo's crimes so sensational. The lesson was perverse but effective. Standard brutality was more practical than supernatural terrorism. That said, elements of ritual and superstition continue to exist within some cartel operations. Some cartel members still practice forms of folk magic for protection, and shrines to folk saints like Jesus Malverde, the narco saint, are common. But the organized, systematic use of human sacrifice as practiced by Constanzo's cult has not been replicated on the same scale. More than 3 decades after the discovery at Rancho Santa Elena, the Adolfo Constanzo case remains one of the most disturbing episodes in criminal history. It represents a unique convergence of factors: drug trafficking, religious manipulation, sadistic violence, and human psychology, that created a perfect storm of horror. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and religious scholars trying to understand how such extreme violence can emerge from the intersection of belief and crime. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership, the vulnerability of human psychology to manipulation, and the potential for religious practices to be perverted into tools of control and violence. For the families of the victims, the passage of time has not erased the pain. Mark Kilroy's parents continued their advocacy work until their own deaths, trying to create something positive from their tragedy. The families of the Mexican victims, many of whom received little attention or support, have had to find their own ways to cope with their losses. The physical locations associated with the cult have taken on their own dark mythology. Rancho Santa Elena was eventually destroyed, but the site remains a place of morbid fascination. Some locals claim the area is haunted, that the spirits of the victims remain trapped there. Others avoid mentioning the place at all, as if speaking of it might somehow resurrect its evil. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Constanzo case is how little has actually changed in the conditions that made it possible. The drug trade between Mexico and the United States continues to generate enormous profits and corresponding violence. Corruption remains endemic in many Mexican law enforcement agencies. Poverty and lack of education still make some populations vulnerable to exploitation by those claiming supernatural powers. While the specific combination of human sacrifice and drug trafficking that characterized Constanzo's cult has not been repeated, the underlying dynamics remain. Charismatic leaders continue to exploit vulnerable followers. Criminal organizations continue to use terror to control territory and populations. The intersection of crime and belief continues to produce violence, even if it takes different forms. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about the role of belief in human behavior. How different is the faith that led Constanzo's followers to commit murder from other forms of ideological violence? When people believe they're acting according to divine will or supernatural necessity, what limits exist on their behavior? These questions extend far beyond the specifics of the Constanzo case to fundamental issues about human nature and society. Even with all the investigations, trials, and analyses, aspects of the Constanzo case remain mysterious. How many people did the cult really kill? Were there other cells or groups operating under Constanzo's direction that were never discovered? How extensive was the network of corruption that protected them? These questions will likely never be fully answered. There's also the psychological mystery of how Constanzo himself understood what he was doing. Did he believe his own mythology? Was he conscious of his manipulation, or had he convinced himself of his own divinity? His death prevented any deep psychological examination, leaving us to speculate based on second-hand accounts and his surviving writings. The rapid descent from fortune-telling and spiritual cleansing to human sacrifice and cannibalism raises questions about whether this progression was always Constanzo's intention or whether he was corrupted by power and opportunity. Did he start as a genuine believer who lost his way, or was he always a predator looking for the right circumstances to express his violence? The story of Adolfo Constanzo and his cult stands as one of the darkest chapters in modern criminal history. It demonstrates the terrifying potential that exists when criminal enterprise merges with religious fanaticism, when charismatic leadership meets vulnerable followers, and when the institutions meant to protect society fail in their duty. For those who study crime, the case offers crucial insights into how extreme violence can be normalized within a group context. It shows how intelligent, otherwise rational people can be led to commit atrocities when they believe they're serving a higher purpose. It reveals the power of belief to override moral constraints and the danger of ideologies that devalue human life. For society more broadly, the Constanzo case serves as a warning about the importance of education, critical thinking, and strong institutions. It reminds us that in the absence of these protections, people can fall prey to those who would exploit their fears and hopes for personal gain. It shows that evil often comes not in obviously monstrous forms but dressed in the garments of religion, protection, and belonging. The victims of Adolfo Constanzo's cult, Mark Kilroy and at least 14 others whose names are known, plus however many unknown victims there may have been, died horrific deaths in service to one man's megalomaniacal fantasies. Their stories remind us of the very real human cost of unchecked power and manipulation. They deserved better from the systems that should have protected them, and their memory demands that we remain vigilant against those who would use belief as a weapon. As we look back on this case from a distance of more than 30 years, it's tempting to see it as an aberration, a unique confluence of circumstances that could never be repeated. But the conditions that created Adolfo Constanzo, inequality, corruption, desperation, and the human hunger for meaning and power, remain with us. The specific form his evil took may have been unique, but the potential for similar horrors remains as long as these underlying conditions persist. The true lesson of the Adolfo Constanzo case may be that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we like to believe. Given the right circumstances, ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary evil. It's a reminder that maintaining a just and humane society requires constant vigilance, not just against external threats but against the darkness that can emerge from within our own communities when fear, greed, and fanaticism are allowed to flourish unchecked. In the end, Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo's legacy is not the supernatural power he claimed to possess but the very human horror he inflicted. He stands as a reminder that the real monsters are not supernatural beings but human beings who choose to treat other humans as objects for their own purposes. His cult's reign of terror may have ended with his death in 1989, but the scars left on families, communities, and societies remain, a permanent testament to the devastating consequences when evil wearing the mask of divinity is allowed to flourish in the shadows of corruption and desperation.